So welcome everybody to this new session of the interdisciplinary dialogues of the CEPREMAP, which is for this time organized in collaboration with the OZ collaborative project of the Paris School of Economics, which is financed by the chair Hermes. And it's also organized in collaboration with the Regional and Urban Economic Seminar Series that we co-organized with Laurent Gobillon. So the objective of this new series of interdisciplinary dialogues is to facilitate an interdisciplinary dialogue between different social science on a specific topic. And so the first session of this seminar series was devoted to the question of why demographic transition is slower than expected in Africa. And so the second session of this interdisciplinary dialogue will focus on a completely different but also very interesting topic, which is on the role played by neighborhoods and places on intergenerational mobility. So to discuss these issues, I am super grateful to the three speakers who have accepted our invitation to present, and will share with us their knowledge on this topic, and also they will give us their insights from different pieces of social sciences, which is the objective of this kind of seminar. So we will start the seminar with a presentation by Léa Platte-Boustan, who is an economist from Princeton University, who will talk more specifically on the upward mobility of the first and second generation of immigrants in the US. Then we will turn to a presentation by Patrick Charquet, who is a sociologist from Princeton University, who will pinpoint how social upward mobility is actually highly related to spatial mobility and to the capacity of people of migrating outside their native neighborhood. And then we will end the webinar with the presentation of Michael Storpers, who is a geographer and also an economist from the London School of Economics and UCLA. And we will bring back to the front of the talk the long-term changes of social mobility across US regions. So, but before moving to this presentation, I would like to thank also the three panelists who also accepted to introduce these interdisciplinary discussions associated to each presentation. So Florian Ménéris, Ale Macave, and Clara Martinez-Toledano. And I would like also to thank the administrative staff of the CEPREMAP and the Paris School of Economics, especially Eugénie, Julia, and Laurent, for helping me in managing this online event. So I'm going to stop here. And I will give the floor to Léa Boustan for a 25 minutes presentation. So Léa, if you can share your screen for the audience. So let me suggest that you write all your questions in the chat during the presentation. And so with the panelist, Florian, we will collect those questions during the talk. And then we will make a kind of compilation. And if we have time, we will let you take the floor at the end of the presentation and after Florian's discussion for asking your question and following with the presentation of the second presenter. So, Léa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Muren. Thank you for organizing such a stimulating set of panelists today. I just want to make sure that everyone can see like one big screen. Yeah, okay, good. So I'm excited to be here with Michael, who's my former colleague from UCLA. And I'm actually going to draw on some of his work in my talk today, and with Pat, who's my current colleague here at Princeton. And like Pat said, we live right down the street from each other, demonstrating the importance of space and geography in our intellectual endeavors. So I'm going to talk about the role of geography in the process of immigrant assimilation in the US, both in the past, the Ellis Island generation of immigrants around 100 years ago, coming mostly from Europe, and today as well. So this image is a map of all of the counties in the United States, and you can see by the colors their largest immigrant group as of the year 1920. So you can see a lot of spatial differentiation for immigrants coming from a variety of different places. The blue in the middle from Austria and Germany, the orange scattered here from Ireland, etc. So this is the kind of geographic differentiation that I will be talking about today. So I want to argue that geographic location was absolutely central for immigrant advancement in the historical United States, both for the immigrants themselves and for their children. But from what I can tell, and this piece is a more speculative and hopefully will give rise to future research, geography plays less of a role in the strong upward mobility patterns that we see for the children of immigrants today. So the children of immigrants are just as mobile as they were in the past, but it seems like some of the pathways to mobility have changed. One possibility is that immigrants are more clustered in enclaves today, and that might be what is holding immigrants back, or why geography matters less, but that cannot explain what's going on. That will be my argument at the very end. So this is a call for future research. Before I begin, I want to give you a bird's eye view of immigration to the US in the past 150 years. I think we're all familiar with the last few points on this figure. What we're seeing here is the share of the US population that's foreign born. And up until recently, the past few years, 14% of the US population is now foreign born. And that has generated some concern among politicians and pundits in the US. But if you scale back, you can see that actually there was this earlier period of immigration 100 years ago, during which time 14% of the population was foreign born for over 50 years. And in between, there was an era of falling immigration that was policy driven. And so this was a closure of the border in the 1920s that then reopened partially in 1965, giving rise to this U-shaped pattern. So it does not go without saying that the US will always welcome immigrants, and the 14% foreign-born share that we have now might change in the future. So it's very important to understand the assimilation patterns of our immigrants today to help guide policy. So I'm going to compare these two eras that are circled here, the past and present. And for the past, let me introduce the type of data that I will be talking about. The data will come from digitized census records. So this picture here gives you a sense of what an underlying census manuscript would look like. All of this manuscript-based data has been digitized and is now available in computerized fashion by volunteers that contributed to the data that's now at ancestry.com and is now shared with researchers. After 72 years, census data is de-anonymized, so we can actually see the names. And that allows us to step in and create algorithms to link individuals over time across various census waves. So I will be talking about following an immigrant over time throughout his or her career, and then also following the children of the immigrants as well. This picture that I selected is not at random. This is my great-grandfather, Hyman, living in Chicago. He was an immigrant. You can see he reports his arrival in 1886. And these are his 8 children. This guy circled down here, who's 7 years old, is my grandfather. And on the next page, you could see the occupations of my great-grandfather and my great uncles and aunts, who working at proprietor in a store or a stenographer or bookkeeper. And this is the kind of economic information that we have about people up until the year 1940. So when we talk about income for the past, we'll be talking about an occupation-based income measure. Okay. So let me begin with the first fact about immigrants in the past, which is that geography plays an important role in the earnings of immigrants during this period. So I'm going to start without looking at any geography at all and just compare the earnings of immigrants that we follow over their time in the US relative to the US born. The US born are the 0 line here, and then these dots are coefficients that tell you by how much do immigrants earn more or less than the US born. And you can see a very flat line. And so note that this is a weighted average. There's some immigrant groups then, like from Germany, from the UK, from Scotland, that are earning a lot, and some that are earning a little, immigrants from Italy or from Portugal. And so this is going to be a weighted average of basically the Northern and Western Europeans pulling it up and the Southern and Eastern Europeans pulling it down. But what you can see is that as time goes on and immigrants spend more time in the US, they're not gaining and they're not losing relative to the US born. Everyone is earning a little more as they get older, but immigrants not at a differential pace. Now, let's just add 2 elements of geography. What if we're comparing people who live in the same state? That's going to be the orange line, or people who live in urban areas versus rural areas. That's the blue line. And you can see that immigrants on average actually earn a lot less than US born in the same state, or earn a lot less than other US born living in an urban area. So how is it that immigrants overall have this pretty positive and successful outcome in terms of occupation-based earnings? Well, they're moving to states that have high pay on average, and they're moving to cities that have higher pay than rural areas. And so immigrants are able to get ahead at this time through their geographic choices. So that's fact number 1. Now, fact number 2 is going to be about the children of immigrants. And this requires matching the parents forward to the kids. Here, we're only able to match sons because we are using first and last name as an important matching criteria. And when women got married, especially at the time, they changed their last name. So this is 2 different eras of the past. Kids that were living at home in 1880 with their parents, or kids that were living at home in 1910. We're looking at the rank that their father sat in the income distribution when they were in childhood, and comparing it to the rank of the children when they themselves are in adulthood 30 years later. The blue dots tell you what's going on with the children of US born fathers, and the orange dots tell you what's going on with the children of immigrant fathers. And what I want you to focus on is not so much the upward sloping lines. Of course, if you are raised by a higher income father, you yourself are more likely to be high income, but more the fact that the orange dots are almost always above the blue dots. So being raised by an immigrant father is going to put you in a location, as it turns out, that allows you to have more upward mobility. The same thing is true today. This is data not from, of course, our census data, but from underlying IRS tax records, where a parent will claim a child as a dependent on the tax forms. And then this data was provided to us in aggregate form by the Opportunity Atlas team. Now, fact number 2 is going to be that geography can explain a large portion, if not all, of the mobility that I showed you for the past. So I'm going to be looking at the 2 cohorts, the 1880 kids and the 1910 kids, and start out with each one of these figures on the left-hand side, and you can see the average rank gap for children that are being raised at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. So going back, you can see that would be this dot over here, the 25th percentile child. Where do they end up in adulthood? And they end up on average around 5 or 6 rank points higher. Now let's try to statistically explain this advantage for the children of immigrants, just controlling for the fact that immigrants are less likely to move to the South in the past can explain half of what's going on. The South was an area that even for white Southerners, but especially for Black Southerners, was not a location with high upward mobility for anyone. And so immigrants, by avoiding that location, were setting up their kids for more success. And then all the way on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see what happens if we're going all the way down to the county level, and we're controlling for county fixed effects. So we're saying, let's take two families that live in the same county. One has an immigrant dad, one has a US born dad, and you see that actually their kids are doing no different. So the major advantage that's over on the left-hand side of this graph is coming from the location choices that immigrant parents are making. Now, is this still going on today? That's going to be a subject of some speculation for the rest of, I think I may have like 10 minutes or so. And I have less to say on this that is definitive, but there are some intriguing patterns that suggest that geography may not be explaining what's going on. Now, remember today, children do have a mobility advantage if they're being raised in immigrant families relative to US born. So there is some mechanism underlying this. And the first thing we want to know is it geography? I'm going to show you a couple of maps that suggest that this might not be the case. First of all, where did the children of immigrants live in the past, and where do they live now? In the past, the darker red, the county, suggests that a larger share of the population are sons of immigrant parents, so second generation sons. Very high rates in the upper Midwest and all through the Rust Belt, which are the industrial areas of the Midwest, and then into New England. Where are the children of immigrants living today? Well, we have a sort of a proxy for that just by looking at the foreign born. It's not perfect, but here you can see that the foreign born are living in the border areas today. So in California, in Texas, and then in Florida, as well as in a couple of big cities through the coasts. So a very different geography of where immigrants are living or second generation living now. Now I'm going to turn to Michael's work with Dylan Connor, who's a common student of ours that came out a couple years ago in PNAS, to take a look at the geography of upward mobility. So you'd have to combine the location of immigrants with the maps that you see here on upward mobility to make the connection. Where was the most upwardly mobile places in the past? You have to look at the areas that are light on this heat map to find the areas of high upward mobility. So all through the Rust Belt, through New England, those were areas with very high immigrant density, as well as in the West Coast, but not at all in the South. So immigrants are concentrating in the highly upwardly mobile locations in the past. What about today? Remember, the light pattern means highly upward. The darker pattern means low upward mobility. So there's not much upward mobility in California, in the coastal area of Texas, in Florida, and again, not in the South. So a lot of the places that immigrants are concentrating today are not the areas of high upward mobility for kids. So I think that this picture from the Connor and Storber paper says it all. If we're looking at the share of the variation in upward mobility that we saw across these counties in the past, which are the blue dots here, early 20th century, you see that a large share of the variation can be statistically accounted for by foreign-born share. So if there's a high immigrant share in the place, there's also high upward mobility in that place. Today, there's no association at all. And so it seems like immigrants are no longer concentrating in areas that are of high upward mobility for kids. Now, the kids of immigrants are still doing very well today. So this is suggestive that we need to be in the market for a different mechanism. Oftentimes, as social scientists, we do say, well, if the patterns look the same, let's turn to the same mechanisms to explain them and be as parsimonious as possible. But it seems like in this case that might not work. I do want to note, though, that immigrants do still locate in productive cities. So it's not that the immigrants themselves are no longer making location choices that are economically advantageous. It seems that immigrants are much more likely to be found in metro areas that have high nominal wages, which are suggestive of high productivity, as well as high housing prices. So this is a graph that comes from Albert and Monras, and they're correlating immigrant concentration in a metro with, in this case, the housing price index, but also they've done the same for the nominal wage index, and you see these upward sloping relationships. So they have an intriguing theory that because immigrants spend a portion of their consumption abroad, either sending remittances home or planning for return migration and saving up in order to maybe construct a house at home in retirement, they specialize in living in high-cost areas. They care more about receiving high nominal wages today and are more willing to economize on housing in the current period in order to save up for the future or to send remittances home. So it does seem like immigrants are making economic choices that are advantageous, but it seems that these areas are no longer the sites of high intergenerational mobility today. So to summarize what we've seen, geography explains much of the upward mobility for children of immigrants in the past, maybe less so today. And I say maybe because, recall, our modern data comes from underlying tax records and is only provided to us in an aggregate form. So it's not something that we are able to analyze ourselves. We don't have access to the underlying microdata, but it's something that we do hope that maybe in partnership or additional research teams could look into. So the question is really, why do the children of immigrants continue to surpass the children of the US born today? If geography is not the explanation, what is the role, for example, of education and additional human capital investments that immigrant families might make? Miran, do I have a couple of minutes left, or I see it's 11:25, but.
You have 5 minutes left, if you like.
Oh, okay, good, great. Because I wanted to say a few things about enclaves. One of the thoughts I had when putting all this together is, well, maybe immigrants are choosing the high nominal wage areas, but they're locating in that metro in an immigrant neighborhood, in an enclave that might make it challenging for their kids to learn English or reach out to labor market networks and social networks outside of the immigrant community. So maybe immigrants are more likely to locate in enclaves now, and that might undermine the general relationship between geographic location and upward mobility. But it seems like the answer to this is no. And the reason is threefold, and I will mention these three, provide one piece of evidence on each, and then I'll conclude. So the first is that immigrants are equally likely to live in enclaves in the past and present. So that would really seem to undermine the theory. The second is that some evidence suggests that enclaves may even be beneficial today. This is evidence that comes from cases of refugee resettlement in Denmark and Sweden. So it may or may not apply to the US, but it's certainly suggestive. And also some work that we have done has suggested that living in large enclaves was harmful in the past. And so if enclaves were harmful in the past, but beneficial today, and immigrants are equally likely to live in enclaves in the past and present, it doesn't seem like this could be the story of what's going on. So to begin, immigrants are just as likely to live in enclaves in the past and today. I'm showing you here the isolation index over the century, which is measured as the share foreign born in the neighborhood of the average immigrant. And it starts out in 1910 at 8%. It falls over the century with that declining immigration inflow that we saw when we took the bird's eye view. And it's been rising with the rising immigrant share today, back up to 8% in 2010. Now, of course, the areas with the largest enclaves have changed. And so we have this image of places like Miami or the Bay Area or LA with large immigrant enclaves today. And in the past, it was New Bedford, Massachusetts, Passaic, New Jersey, or New York. So the geography of where the largest enclaves are located has changed, but the average experience of immigrants in terms of isolation in their neighborhood from potential US born or mainstream job networks or social networks has not changed. Also, the modern evidence seemed to suggest that at least living with some others from the home country is beneficial. There's other references besides these, but the initial work was done by Per Anders Eden and co-authors with Swedish policy to redistribute refugees outside of the major cities. And then here we actually have a good instrument for location because it was a government policy of relocation. And it seems that being assigned to an area with others from your home country improves earnings. So it could be that today living in an enclave is beneficial. But I would note that it's hard to necessarily generalize to the US because the refugee enclaves in this context are relatively small. Finally, we've done some work recently on the role of enclaves in the past. We focused on a relocation program for Jewish enclaves in the beginning of the century. This is a map of New York, and you can see the areas with large Jewish settlement, like the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We look at a program called the Industrial Removal Office that provided train fare to relocate immigrants around the country. And we compare people who were relocated out of this large enclave to people who were living next door, basically. That's our comparison group. And what we find is that the program definitely worked. So here you see that compared to the comparison group, people who participated in the program were in neighborhoods that were equally Jewish in 1910 and much less Jewish by 1920. So they moved out of the enclave for sure. And they moved to areas with higher white collar share, higher share homeowner, higher share English speaking. So there's a lot of elements of the move that seems like the neighbors changed. And we find associated gains in income for first and second generation immigrants of around 7%. So it seems that relocating from the big enclaves in the past was beneficial, whereas today it seems like there's evidence suggesting that living in an enclave can be protective. So I will end by saying that there's still a lot of puzzles that remain here. We know that in the past, geography contributed greatly to economic advancement, both for the first and second generation. But today, it seems like location does not confer as many intergenerational advantages. Yet the children of immigrants do experience upward mobility to nearly the same degree. So understanding of new mechanisms beyond geography is needed. Just wanted to put in a plug for Streets of Gold, which is our book that covers this type of material as well as many other elements of our research, which is coming out in a few weeks.
Okay, so thank you. It's great publicity for your work. So I hope many people will buy your book. Thank you very much for this extremely clear presentation. So I will now give the floor to Florian for launching the interdisciplinary dialogue with the audience. So Florian, the floor is yours.
Excellent. You can see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Leah, for the presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation to discuss this presentation. It was really a great pleasure to go through the slides, and on the occasion of going through the slides, to go to the papers mentioned in the slides. To prepare a very short discussion, it will be only 3 hints to introduce the discussion with the audience. So I think I can be very quick on that. The message conveyed by Leah was super clear. Immigrants have a higher intergenerational mobility compared to native US citizens, both in the past and today. In the past, geography explained much of this difference between immigrants and natives in terms of intergenerational mobility. It seems to be less the case today, and the propensity to locate in enclaves does not seem to be a plausible explanation. So we need more research to explain this puzzle. And so my first hint for the discussion will be trying to propose an interpretation for this puzzle or an explanation for it based on what is related to places and what is related to people in this greater intergenerational mobility for immigrants. So in some of your work, Leah, you actually show that there is some evidence which is also, I guess, consistent with things we can observe, that immigrants, when they arrive in a country, they are ranked lower in the income distribution compared to what they would be in their home country, given their level of education. And so part of this higher mobility may be just some kind of catching up of the kids compared to this kind of misplacement in the income distribution of their parents. And so my question here is, could it be the entire story? in the sense that we know that when immigrants come to a country, there may be several reasons guiding their location decision within the country. They might go in places where there are jobs that are available to us. They might go in places where there is already a diaspora, where there is already a network from their country, so in the areas where they go in the country, or they might go to places that are close to their ports of entry. And if for some reason, at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, those places that had jobs for immigrants, where the diasporas were, that were close to the ports of entry, happened to be high mobility places, then you do not observe a difference when you control for places between immigrants and natives, just because these high mobility places are by definition places where the role of the family background on income and adulthood is cancelled, I would say. And if for some reason, the geography of the jobs available for migrants, the geography of diaspora, the geography of the ports of entry has changed today, and if for some reason, those places where migrants go today, where there are jobs, where there are diasporas that are close to the ports of entry, are low mobility places, like you talk of the South, for example, and we know that there is a lot of migration from Hispanic people coming from Latin America, then there is scope again for the better family background, I would say, of immigrants to show up in this upward mobility. So that was my first point. Very quickly, then much more general points for discussion. And so have you elements to share with us about the comparative perspective on this differential intergenerational mobility. So comparative from the point of view of the countries, we know that not all destinations are perceived in the same way by prospective immigrants. I talked with someone coming from Moldova, living here in Canada, and she told me when they moved, they could have gone to Germany, they could have gone to France, where they had a lot of cousins and relatives. They decided to go to Canada, where they had fewer relatives, and the idea was, be it in Germany, France, or Canada, we will still be people from Moldova. But for our kids, we knew that in Canada, they would become Canadian. And while in France and in Germany, they would remain people from Moldova. So are you aware of comparative studies? I know that OECD did something in this respect. If you have elements to share on this, I think it would be interesting. Last thing, comparative study also in terms of intergenerational mobility, in terms of education versus in terms of income. It might be the case that you have mobility in terms of education, but given the interconnection between education and labor market, this might not show up in an intergenerational mobility in terms of income. This could be true both within countries or across countries. So between local labor markets, not all local labor markets might translate education into higher levels of income in the same way. And so here again, I would be happy to hear your views if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. So maybe Leah, you would like to provide some kind of answers, or?
Thanks so much, Florian. I think that you know your comments sort of just heighten the puzzle and the call for more work. One possibility, like you mentioned, is that there's misplacement of immigrants in the income distribution, and so the mobility of kids is sort of catching up to where they should be. That would be true also in the past, and it would be true also today. And so that could be the entire story, but then it's sort of, why is it showing up only now and not in the past? You know, there's a variety of different forces behind an immigrant's location choice, enclave, proximity to port, and economic opportunity. And so why has that location choice seemed to change over time too? So there's a number of sort of further refinements of the question in your comments, which I really appreciated. I think this is going to come down to us collectively as researchers being able to find the right data to answer these questions. So it's something I hope to pursue in the US, but then that gets to your second point about comparative studies. I think we need to do more across the many immigrant receiving countries today, and not assume that the case in the US is going to hold, especially in European countries. So the one paper I would point people to that I know well, I can put it into the chat, is by a whole team of co-authors, Jan Algen, Christian Dussmann, and others. Economic situation of first and second generation immigrants in France, Germany, and the UK. I'll put that into the chat right now. And my takeaway from it is that the story is less hopeful when we think about those three receiving countries. But then work that I've seen done in Australia and in Canada actually seems to fit more with the US case. And so your anecdote about where an immigrant might choose to live, Canada versus a European country, does seem to fit with what people are finding. But this work is really just at the infancy, because we've needed to have administrative data where we can link generations over time. And that's only been present for, let's say, the past 10 years in large numbers. So there's a lot more that we need to learn about what the mechanisms look like across these different countries.
Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks, Leah. So maybe we have still 1 or 2 minutes for question from the audience. Myrène, I have your go for that.
Yes. So Laurent has a question.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got a couple of questions, sorry. Hello, Leah. So my first question was whether you may have some composition effect of migrant wave when you have a look in the long run, because I guess it's not the same immigrants. If you take a given migrant group, do you get the same story, at least the same evolution? Second one is there any role of the housing markets here? Because in France, for instance, large cities have become very expensive, okay? So it's pretty complicated for immigrants to live in large cities, except in enclaves, actually, but enclaves are bad. It is bad quality in France, for instance. So I was wondering if there's something like this in the US, which would explain more isolation. And my third question was, is there any possible role of the type of jobs that are available? Because, you know, we are now we've got more services, and there's complementarity between high skill and low skill jobs. And so if low skill immigrants and children of immigrants occupy low skill jobs, I'm not in that kind of perspective, I'm not sure they've got a lot of possibilities to evolve, because it's like bottom jobs. And so they've got some jobs, they earn some money, but evolution is not granted. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think Laurent is hitting on exactly the directions that we should go. So thank you. I think we see that immigrants are still making economic choices that are setting themselves up for high earnings. They're still going to the high nominal wage locations. And they seem to specialize in that because they're willing to reserve some of their consumption to be spent in the home country. So they're willing to accept these high housing prices more so than, say, the US born would. But these are places that combine very high skilled, finance and tech and medicine with low skilled service. That's not the location that sets up kids for second generation success. If kids are going to move beyond parents, which they do, that would not be the location that necessarily offers the right mix of jobs or the right quality of public schooling for their kids. And so now there's a tension between the parent choice and the kid choice. It used to be that the parent choice was for the high quality, high wage jobs that the parents, the best the parent could achieve, was also the location that would set their kids up for success. And that seems not to be the case now. So it's something having to do with type of jobs available and something having to do with high housing prices. The scatter that I showed you it would look almost the same if you were looking at high immigrant share, high wage, or high immigrant share, high housing prices. And that also might mean that the kids are not able to stay in this area. Maybe this area is reasonable for the kids, but they're not able to stay there because they can't afford to get into the housing market. So I think that you've outlined a number of quite sensible explanations for what might be going on, kind of answering Florian's question about like why, here are 3 different options of how immigrants choose. Is it enclaves? Is it jobs? Is it proximity to port? And it might have been jobs all along, but jobs today mean something different than jobs in the past and doesn't necessarily correlate with the next generation. I know you had another question as well, but I do want to, I don't know how much time we have, and in case there's anyone else who wanted to jump in.
No worries.
Maybe one last question, and then we will move on the second presentation, if there is one. No? Okay, so we can, in any case, we can keep the question to the end of the talk. So thank you very much, Leah. So we are going now for this super interesting and stimulating discussion. So we are going to move to the second presentation by Patrick. So Patrick, do you want to share your slide? Okay, so that's perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maren. Thanks for bringing us together. And congrats to Leah for the book coming out. That's fantastic. That's good news. So these 3 talks will go very well together. This is fun to have these 3 in succession. So mine is kind of a part of this large research agenda that is looking at the connection between spatial inequality and various other forms of inequality, and making the case that there is a strengthening link here. So I'm going to talk about the link between spatial inequality and economic inequality today, with mostly just some descriptive observations and then a little bit of early stage work trying to move toward explanation. I'll make 4 points. The first couple are just descriptive observations of what has happened in the U.S. And I apologize that this is so U.S. centric. It's the 3 of us, I think, have all done most of our work in the U.S. But anyway, I know too little to make confident claims about other countries. All of my research has been on the U.S. and has been applied work with a policy focus. But I do apologize for that. So the first point is, again, just a descriptive observation about what has changed, building on other people's work, including the work that you'll see from Michael next. And you can make the case that spatial inequality is rising in a whole bunch of different ways. One is to look at regional variation in economic conditions or upward mobility, as Leah pointed to Michael's paper showing that regional inequality, and others just to look at the neighborhoods where people live and the degree of economic segregation. And so this is a very basic look at how economic segregation has changed since 1970, which just looks at the proportion of families that live in neighborhoods that are on the extreme in one way or another, with a heavy concentration of affluent or lower income residents. And you can see that these groups in the middle of the distribution, groups that are living in more economically diverse neighborhoods, are just shrinking over time. There's been some questions about the latter decades here, and some that have gotten into some of the specifics of the data sources, but this general trend has persisted for a long time of increasing economic segregation by income, even as racial segregation has declined in the U.S. This graph is from a former student of mine, Gerard Torres Espinosa, who has just documented how income segregation has changed over time, and then where it's changed. What's the decomposition between neighborhoods within commuting zones versus across commuting zones. And what he's shown is that segregation of poverty and of affluence have both risen, but most of the increase has come from segregation at the top of the distribution. And then there has been growth both in segregation within and between commuting zones, but a higher proportion of that growth is now across commuting zones. Okay, so meaning that there's more and more regional inequality, even as the neighborhoods within commuting zones become more and more unequal. This is one graph that I just pulled that I always point to because it encapsulates a lot of what has changed in the variation between areas, urban areas of the U.S. in a very simple way. So the y-axis here is just a difference in the education level between newcomers to an urban area and people who leave. And so if you're higher on the y-axis, it just means that the new entrants to an urban area are better educated than the people who are leaving. And then the x-axis is home values. So you see this multi-dimensional form of change that is happening. And this is just since 2005, where you have areas that are becoming more and more unequal in terms of the resources, the human capital that people are bringing to those areas, and then they're becoming more and more exclusive, and so that's creating this new form of inequality, not new form, but this enhanced form of inequality within areas where you have high wage areas that just offer very little affordable housing, and thus are becoming increasingly less livable for lower income segments of the population. So those are just a few ways to document this trend of growing spatial inequality. In the U.S., I just point out that the history of research on intergenerational income mobility is a history where people were essentially trying to get the right estimate for what the intergenerational elasticity of family income or earnings is in the country as a whole. I think in the past maybe 20 years, that idea, the very idea that there is one level of mobility in the nation as a whole, has just been blown apart. And we have Michael's work has kind of reinforced the idea that there is no level of mobility in the U.S. as a whole. We have extreme inequality, and a long time ago that was much less the case. I'll let others who have done that work make that point in more detail. But you have a growing level of spatial inequality. And then this other characteristic of spatial inequality in the US, which I think is sometimes not given sufficient attention, is its rigidity, how persistent spatial inequality is. And again, you can make this case in a number of different ways. In my work, I've looked at neighborhood conditions over multiple generations, and like if you were to estimate one level of intergenerational income elasticity, the typical estimates are in the range of between 0.4 and 0.5 at this point. If you were to make the same estimate for neighborhood income, meaning the kinds of neighborhoods that people live in one generation, then the next generation, it's up around 0.63, 0.65. And in part that's mechanical because neighborhoods are aggregated areas, but the implications are important nonetheless. It means that even as people make moves in the income distribution, even as families change, their neighborhood conditions are much more sticky, are much more rigid. And so what this graph shows is just the proportion. This is particularly true for Black Americans in the U.S., and the consequences have been particularly severe for Black Americans in the U.S. because they have been tied to places that have had high levels of downward mobility, places that have gone downhill because of active disinvestment. So this graph just makes a case that we typically study the impact of neighborhoods by looking at conditions in a given year over a few years of a child's life. This is showing that when we do that, we miss the fact that neighborhood disadvantage is multi-generational, particularly for Black Americans. So about half of Black Americans' families over the past two generations have lived in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, not at a single point in time, not over a few years, but over consecutive generations. And that is extremely rare for white Americans. These differences largely persist when you adjust for everything that we can observe about those families. And so part of this persistence of neighborhood advantage and disadvantage is driven by staying in the same place. It's driven by attachments to the same places. And what this graph shows is that if you look at the persistence. So this is just an estimate of intergenerational elasticity. And you look at people who have stayed in the same county over multiple generations versus those who haven't, then whatever you control for, whatever measures income, education, and so forth that you control for, the effect of staying within the same place has a strong impact on the persistence of neighborhood disadvantage and advantage over time. That matters now in the US because geographic mobility has been falling for a long time now. So the top line here is just the percentage of people who say they've moved in the past year, a trend that has been on the decline for a long time now in the US, and I think is not fully explained. But then if you look at the percentage of people who report long distance moves, moving out of the county, moving to a different county, moving to a different state, that's the red line on the bottom, those changes are more recent, and I think they're more consequential. So this is a more complicated trend. And there are different kinds of moves that matter more or less. I think the important thing here is that this trend is particularly pronounced for lower income Americans, and particularly for Black Americans. So for the past century, Black Americans were more likely than white Americans to make long distance moves. That's primarily explained by the Great Migration of Black Americans out of the rural South. But in the past generation, since the 1970s, the opposite has been true. Black Americans have been more likely to stay in the same place, and this has happened at the same time as those places have been areas of disinvestment, areas that have declined, or that are at least much more likely to have declined over the past 50 years. So this combination of factors, that you have this multi-generational persistence of neighborhood advantage and disadvantage, combined with this decline of long-range moves that lead people out of declining areas or lead people into areas of opportunity, creates this dilemma about rising regional inequality, rising levels of remaining in place. The third point that I want to make, and this is kind of the key part of the research agenda, and a part that I think maybe at least in the US context has not gotten as much attention as it should, is the way that our interventions into space, the way that we divide and carve up space, has created and exacerbated and reinforced spatial inequality. And so I'll just give a few examples. There's a long history of interventions into space in the US that are designed really for one central reason, and that's separation. So this started way back with restrictive racial covenants and racial zoning laws that were, explicitly designed to keep Black and white Americans apart in areas that were integrating. When those kinds of racial zoning laws were declared unconstitutional, it then transformed in a whole bunch of different types of interventions into space that were designed to carve up space in ways that led to separation, but that also led to differential patterns of investment. And so the redlining maps, which were developed by assessors as part of the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, have become the most kind of or one of the more notorious forms of this type of intervention into space. These were maps created by assessors as part of an effort to provide home financing, refinancing during the Great Depression, as lots of families were at risk of losing their homes. Federal government decided, okay, we need a large-scale effort to keep people in their homes. This was the first piece of that effort, where assessors went out into cities and made assessments about the risk of the loans that would be refinanced, and made that assessment on a whole bunch based on a whole bunch of characteristics of the place, including immigrant status, including income, including racial and ethnic composition in cities across the country. So this led to this. This was the first step in an effort to kind of mark areas of cities as places for investment or disinvestment with consequences. I'll show you some evidence in a minute that have persisted over the next century. This is just one example. So there are a whole set of interventions that have taken place over time. The second example that I'll give here is the interstate highway system. This is Atlanta. This is kind of the heart of Atlanta before the interstate highways were built as part of the era that is typically called urban renewal in the US, where communities of color were consolidated. That was done both through these kinds of investments. This is before the interstate highway system. This is after the interstate highway system, where you had large freeways going through the heart of American cities. Up on the top left, you see a new stadium that was built as part of this period of urban renewal, where neighborhoods were carved up, Black population was consolidated into public housing developments, and this allowed a substantial portion of city populations to move out into suburban areas and still take part in economic activity within the city. So this is another example of an intervention into urban space that, in some cases, interstate highways have been associated with higher levels of economic development. So it's not that the only purpose is separation, but the consequences have been increasing spatial inequality. And then a more recent example, which is just the incorporation of new towns and cities. Sandy Springs is an area just north of Atlanta in Georgia. And as Atlanta was dealing with more severe fiscal crisis, as it was dealing with the challenge of racial integration, this relatively affluent area just north of the city, which was going to be annexed by Atlanta, began this 2-decade effort to incorporate as a separate city so that they would have separate property taxes, separate land use regulations. So Sandy Springs decided to zone their land 85% for single family homes. Okay, so the implication then is that apartment buildings would not be built in Sandy Springs. That affordable housing would not be built in Sandy Springs. They then contracted out all of their services to private providers and became like a model of libertarian city in the US. This is just one example of a much broader effort to resist the challenge of integration and the challenge of the cities that American cities were going through, beginning in the 50s all the way through the 1980s and 1990s. By actually incorporating and developing separate towns and cities. So this research agenda has been a multi-year effort where we have gathered data on a whole bunch of different ways that American space is divided, and then are in the process of developing methods to try to identify the impact of these various types of divisions on a range of outcomes. I'll give you just a couple examples. This is a study, early stage project, but the question here is, how does the expansion of incorporation, so how does the establishment of Sandy Springs, Georgia, which was established and incorporated as a separate area from the city of Atlanta, how does that then affect the economic outcomes of different segments of the population in that larger commuting zone, in that larger area? So to operationalize this, we measured the change in the number of town and city governments that incorporated from 1972 to 2012. And there are some cases where areas have consolidated for efficiency and to save money. But the larger trend has been one of new incorporations, where you have a given area that had a given number of cities and towns. And as those cities and towns grew, as the problems became more severe, you see spaces usually around the surrounding suburbs, and then sometimes extending outward, form their own city so that they have separate services, separate police force, separate property taxes, and so forth. Okay, so how do you identify the impact of this type of intervention, this type of fragmentation on outcomes? Here we're using data again from Opportunity Atlas and looking at this measure of upward mobility, that the same one that Leah was using, and we're looking at how does the simple measure of the change in municipal governments per area over this period. The OLS estimate shows a negative relationship. That is, when there are more municipal governments per area, the chances for moving up in the income distribution decline. When we instrument for the change in municipal governments per area, the estimate is actually much stronger. So this tells us that each additional incorporation leads to about a 0.4 percentile decline in income rank for children beginning at the 25th percentile when they reach adulthood, when they reach age 26. And so the first instrument is one that has been used for several different purposes, but it's simply the number of rivers and streams within a commuting zone. This is a measure of natural divisions, natural topographical divisions that make it easier to define a boundary that will separate two areas, whether it's been used for school districts in the past. This is the same logic, but used to identify the impact of changes in municipal governments. And then the second one is state incorporation law. So how difficult is it for groups of people to incorporate and form a new city? And a lot of these laws go back all the way to state constitutions and were developed for entirely different reasons than, a group of people in the 1960s decided that they wanted to maintain an all-white community. And so if you buy this as an instrument, again, the first stage is not quite as strong with the second instrument, but the second stage estimate is almost identical to the estimate that we get with the rivers and streams instrument. So that's one example of the kind. Oh, and a second example, looking at the effect of interstate highway arrays. That this is interstate highways that intersect central business district, and then provide a mechanism for inequality in two ways. One way is by separating communities within those central cities, and secondly, by bringing a substantial portion of the population outside of the central city, which then leads to the formation of new communities outside the central city, creates this exacerbates this level of spatial inequality. So here I'm using an instrument developed by Nathaniel Baum Snow in his work, where we looked at the plan, the 1947 plan for the interstate highway system, which was developed for the purposes of trade and defense and not for suburbanization or exclusion. And we used the rays in that plan to instrument for the actual interstate highway rays that were built in cities to estimate the effect of a commuting zone that has more interstate highway rays intersecting the central city. And again, the estimate shows that with each additional ray that intersects the central city, you have a decline in upward mobility from the bottom of the income distribution. That's one example. I won't go into this example in any more depth. This is a paper published with Dan Aronson, Jacob Faber, and Dan Hartley, and Bhaskar Mazumdar, and myself a couple of years ago, where this went back to the redlining grades and looked at the consequences. They have done, Dan Aronson, Hartley, and Mazumdar had done other work on neighborhood economic development. Here we looked all the way. We looked at the effect of these redlining boundaries in the 1930s on the economic outcomes of children born 50 years later in the 1980s, and showed this very persistent impact. This is not because those boundaries have a direct effect on these kids. It's because these boundaries create a process of investment and disinvestment and selection into these areas around the city that then have long-term consequences on the outcomes for people who live in those areas. So I won't go into more detail there. But the last thing I'll say is that this third point, that interventions into space play a big role in explaining the degree of spatial inequality. They create spatial inequality. The point that I'm trying to make here is that this should change the way that we think about public policy to respond to spatial inequality. There's this kind of long-standing pattern, particularly in the US literature, this question between, okay, do we give people a chance to move out of disadvantaged environments, or do we invest in those environments? Okay, and there's evidence for both of those approaches. So this is a whole bunch of studies that have looked at the effect of moving out of disadvantaged environments. This has to be a part of a policy agenda. There's substantial evidence for the impact of investments within disadvantaged neighborhoods, and this also should be a part of any policy agenda. But the point I want to make here is drawing from that third bullet point that you saw, that public policy has amplified spatial inequality. Our interventions have created and reinforced spatial inequality. There's a third approach to confronting spatial inequality, and that is to stop doing what we've been doing for a long time, to work to break down the barricades, the boundaries that have reinforced spatial inequality. And here there are just several strategies for how to do this. But I think this is a part of the discussion about how to deal with spatial inequality that has been largely left out. When we talk about this in the US, we talk about things that we can do to reduce spatial inequality instead of talking about the things that we're already doing that have created this inequality. So I'll stop there. I'd love any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. So maybe we can turn to the discussion. So LA,
Hi.
Hi.
I have a little PowerPoint too, so I'll share my screen if that's okay. Is that good?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm Haley. I'm really honored to be discussing very briefly this presentation. Patrick, your work has really inspired some of the work that I do in France, so I'll touch upon a little bit whether what you're showing is US-centric or not. But just briefly, I won't summarize the findings again of what you've just said, but I'll try to highlight some of the implications and then put it into perspective with the French case. So in terms of inequality implications, first of all, I think that these kind of two dynamics that really stand out are that we're dealing with processes of selective migration. So the fact that it's not everybody who can move, and moving also in the US at least is decreasing, but it's that certain categories of the population can move, notably those who have the resources to do so and who don't face barriers in housing markets and so forth. So we have selective migration that's shaped by race and class. And then also the fact that places are stratified by the resources that they have. So these kind of two mechanisms really intertwine to produce this kind of long-term inequality. And I think it's kind of interesting to take this research forward to think about how we can better sort of disentangle maybe these processes of who moves where and what are the implications of social mobility, as well as the implications of actually place effects or neighborhood effects. So I think it's still a blind spot to me, kind of the role of, we know that, for instance, children who move and who move young to less disadvantaged places are going to have better outcomes. But I think we don't necessarily really know to what degree that's linked to their parents' social mobility. So to parents who are socially experience upward social mobility, are able to move. Is it really that effect of their parents' social status that's changed, or is it entering into places where they have better educational opportunities, lower exposure to crime, all of these negative effects of neighborhoods that we know about? And I think this is an important question because it gets at sort of the mechanisms also of why we see that this idea of like exposure time to like how long children stay in poor neighborhoods and when they live in those neighborhoods, that really matters, and what that tells us about these mechanisms. And then sort of another implication here that you've touched upon is what's the geographical level that matters when we're looking at the effects of space. And so we know that neighborhoods play a role, but also there are differences. You've highlighted some things about when people stay in the same counties or the same regions and what effect that has. So sort of disentangling more spatial scales at which inequality really plays a role. And then at the sort of towards the end of your presentation, you really touched upon policies and the policy implications here. And I like this idea that we have to move away from the dichotomy sort of that we discuss, and we discuss this in France as well, about whether we need policies that are people-based, so that try to influence the resources and the opportunities of households, or whether we need to invest in places. And rather this idea that maybe we should revise and rethink about the policies that we already have in place. But then more broadly, beyond policy, I'm also sort of thinking about the political implications of the trends that you're highlighting. So this would be more perhaps US specific, but thinking about the increasing political stratification of place in the United States, and particularly like the role of gerrymandering. So we have the fact that electoral districts are drawn along ethnic and racial and class lines, how that sort of works in both ways. So we have, if we have that going on, that leads to greater disenfranchisement of minorities, of low-income people, which is going to further, reduce their opportunities for upward social mobility. And then at the same time, like their inability to escape those places. So beyond policy, kind of like politics as a broader thing, I think is really important. And maybe looking at some of those effects of gerrymandering on these trends would be an interesting avenue for research. And then just in terms of thinking a little bit about France, this is going to be really broad, but we have increasing evidence from quantitative studies in France about the existence of the residential segregation of minorities, so defined based on immigrant status, first and second generation immigrants, and how that's paired with spatial disadvantage. And then some studies that show, similar to your work, that children who grow up in poor neighborhoods tend to stay in those places over time, and that's particularly true for the children of ethno-racial minorities, so of non-European origin, and those from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. And then we do have some evidence as well about sort of these neighborhood effects on educational attainment and employment, as well as, I won't get into the policy details that exist, policy initiatives that exist in France, but kind of similar perverse or negative effects of policies that currently exist or have existed in the past that may have tried to sort of reduce segregation or reduce the negative impact of place, but which have actually in some ways reinforced it or have had perverse effects. So I'll stop there and hand it over to the audience.
Thank you very much, Haley. So maybe, Patrick, do you want to react, or maybe we collect some other questions from the audience first?
Sure, yeah. First, I just want to say thanks. And I think those are great insights, Haley, and particularly the comment on gerrymandering in political districts is another piece that I think I just have overlooked. But another set of outcomes here that I didn't mention here are things like attitudes toward climate change, behavioral responses to COVID, and even segregation by political preferences, which I've looked at using the same methods that I just talked about. But they suggest that another set of boundaries are particularly important, which you've highlighted. So thank you for that, and for bringing in the evidence from France as well.
Thank you. So we have one more question by Laurent.
Sorry, again me. So I had a question actually. It's that if you take highways in the US, I remember from the paper by Nate that they were designed to link cities. Okay, so it was not really about neighborhoods. And then the question is that where they are going to go through the city. Okay, so and which neighborhoods they should go around. So I was so maybe already. I mean, what is important is the detail of the policy here. And the real question, my real question here, is whether there is an important role of local political influence. Okay, because I guess that the whites in the gated communities probably exert political pressure, such that the highways don't go through the neighborhoods or something like this. So,
yes,
I wonder what's your take on that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So that in interpretation, the highways were built for trade. They were built for defense, and that's at least the case that Nathaniel makes for the instrument, is that they were built for this other purpose, and they served that purpose. And then the local siting of where they were actually where those initial 1947 plans turned in actual highways was driven by local decision making. So that's why the instrument does pretty well, I think. But in the consequence was that the siting was influenced by mayors and local decision makers, and with specific designs, at least documented in a number of places, to draw harder boundaries between white and black neighborhoods, to raise entire neighborhoods that were seen as slum housing, and so there was that local decision making was crucial to the actual consequence that the placement of the interstate highways had, and it's coming up more and more. There's more and more attention to that piece of it now. So it was the highways, I think, exacerbate spatial inequality. Even though they increase economic development, they exacerbate spatial inequality in two ways. One, by creating those divisions within the city, but then secondly, by bringing people out so that firms and residents have the option to leave the central city on its own and to develop new towns and cities elsewhere while still having access to the economic activity going on in those cities.
Thank you very much. So maybe we can take another question. There is also kind of remark or reaction by Antoine Dubois. So do you want to take the floor, Antoine?
Yes, thank you very much. I don't really understand how the highway could divide in practice the two neighborhoods, because you can, as we do here in Europe, we build a bridge on top of or above the highway, or we dig a tunnel below the highway, and actually the tunnel doesn't divide the city that much. I mean, it depends, of course, the size of the highway, but I don't understand how you can use a highway to protect yourself from someone from another group. They can just take the bridge or walk down the tunnel.
Yes. So the interstate highways are very substantial divisions. You can't walk across. Below
or above, not on the highway, of course.
Yeah. So what one of the analyses that we're doing is actually looking at. So there's been a large literature that has looked at the consequences for segregation. But one of the things that we can do with this new SafeGraph data, maybe some of you have used it, that just shows mobility movement on a day-to-day basis across areas within a city, is to look at the degree to which spaces within a city are connected by patterns of movement. And to basically, the thought experiment is two neighborhoods that are the same distance away. Is there an influence of whether they are separated by a given barrier, whether it's a river or a highway or a city and town boundary? And there are just enormous differences. So cities were divided in very clear ways by these kinds of interventions, particularly the highways. Development on each side of a highway is entirely different. In a lot of cases, and in some cases, the highways don't make in Atlanta, actually, the highways didn't make as big of a difference because the Black population was growing so quickly that they expanded beyond the boundaries. So in that sense, your point is right, that this is not it doesn't determine the fate of a place, but it does make a huge difference in terms of just the development of an area and the
reducing the connectivity between the two zones. Okay, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. So I think we are going to turn to the last presentation, otherwise we would be late. So Michael, the floor is yours for 25 minutes. So if you want to share your screen. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I think you should see it now.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, so I want to talk about this long-term geography of social mobility, intergenerational social mobility in the United States. And this is work that I have done with Dylan Connor, who's now in geography at Arizona, and Leah and I both were worked with Dylan as a doctoral student, so we owe a lot to him. And Dylan and I have ongoing research that I was going to present, but we're not done with it. We're looking actually currently at where new elite work, how it emerges in the economy over 100 years, and who occupies it, and also how that relates to social mobility, but that'll be forthcoming. All right, so one thing we did in this is we actually used Leah's method, which is we did the historical census record linkage to do our work, and and then this other stuff that we're doing now. All right, so so I'm going to just kind of recapitulate what we did in this PNAS paper. I think most research on intergenerational social mobility, is carried out actually at a finer geographical scale than we did, which is at the neighborhood scale, as for example, the kind of work that Patrick is talking about, and some at counties and metro areas. But the problem with some of that, it's not a problem, but it's a data difficulty, is at those scales, you can't go very far back in time. So if you want to look at it farther back in time, we had to kind of work around those constraints, and you'll see that there are some trade-offs that we made in order to get this long-term picture. And what we did is we went back to a somewhat less fine level of geographical aggregation. This is sort of a wonky methodological point, is we use these 467 state economic areas because it enabled us to do the early work at that scale. To be honest, in an ideal world, I would have wanted to use counties or commuting zones because they're finer. But these are trade-offs. So we can talk about that. I think what we found, and what I'm going to show you is that there is a real long-term geography to both the institutional influences, because we're a federalist country, that echoes some of what Patrick is saying, and to policy choices. States are really important, and localities are really important in shaping policy. In addition, in a federal system. So even when you have federal policy, it gets shaped locally and regionally. And so there should be some kind of feedbacks. All right, so the kind of animating question we have is the current geography of opportunity that you see on the right, and Leah showed this map, something new, or is it a continuation of long-term trends? As Leah mentioned, the lighter colors are areas of higher intergenerational social mobility in the recent period. The darker the color, the lower the levels of mobility. I'll talk more about these in a second. And so by taking this long-term view, we want to look at this issue of change and persistence and what might cause change and persistence, all right? So, Leah also mentioned this, I guess, there's a matching process where you have to look at people from you have to look at where people spend their childhood and then where they end up in adulthood. So underlying, a lot of this kind of research is not only the intergenerational part, but the geographical part is what's the influence of the where of childhood and the where of adulthood, right? And, in a country like the US, like other developed countries, there's a lot, especially historically, a lot of movement, right? Okay, so origin and destination. What we did then is we did two cohorts. We looked at early 20th century, getting the 1900 and 1915 birth cohorts. We linked the 1920 fathers in the census to the 1940 sons. And we look at the adult rank of the sons that are born to fathers that are below the median. So that's a pretty big sample. For the late 20th century, we use the data that were developed by Raj Chetty et al. And we're looking at about 10 million children between 1980 and 2010. So again, childhood locations and then adult destinations. So, you know, this is some of the results. We're looking in the early 20th century. And what you can see here, you're going to see some change, right? And some persistence. So dark is low mobility, light is mobility. And a kind of easy takeaway here is a lot of the West is high mobility and a lot of good chunks of the Northeast and Midwest. Now, these are two very different regions in the early 20th century, it should be said, for non-Americans, which is this area over here in the Northeast and Midwest is is the most highly industrialized and urban part of the country. This is less industrialized and urbanized than the Northeast and Midwest. The South, of course, is still a highly rural area. Less than a half a century away from a slave economy. And of course, involved in Jim Crow, that means new forms of segregation. So again, now what we did is just methodologically is we took these 467 state economic areas and then we aggregated up to sort of 6 big subnational regions. Again, there's a little bit of crudeness in the geography that I don't like, but you do what you can with the data. And again, you can see this story. Now, now what you see here is, let me go back there, is you see, again, these areas of high mobility, as I mentioned a minute ago, and then these areas of low mobility. The South, plantation, slaved, 50 years earlier, rural, and the upper Midwest are plains, which again, for non-Americans are rural areas with large farming operations, relatively sparsely populated, and quite different historically from this part. And Leah mentioned this too, and the immigrant populations of these regions are from different countries. All right. Now, if we look at late 20th century, again, just kind of do an eyeball on this contrast between this map and this map, you can see that a lot changed. There's certain big changes and certain forms of what you might call persistence. So the main persistence here is the South, which remains an area of low mobility, but forms of change that we want to examine are how the upper Midwest, as a place where one spends one's childhood, becomes a high intergenerational social mobility area, and how there is deterioration on the West Coast and in good parts of the Northeast and Midwest. So sort of our deep theme is this sort of, yes, persistence in some areas, but change in others. So again, Rust Belt, this is the Rust Belt, the deep manufacturing areas of the 20th century, and the South, which was rural and very unindustrialized and relatively unurbanized in the early 20th century. By the late 20th century, is becoming an area where manufacturing is moving from the old manufacturing belt into this area that has cheaper labor and more hostility to urbanization, cheaper land, cheaper housing. All right, again, deterioration here in the Northeast and Midwest from their earlier high mobility position, and a rise here in the plains and mountains. So, all right, so that this kind of graphically represents this kind of result that I'm giving you. And what you see here again is, all right, so the persistence in the South of low mobility in both periods. These are the northern plains, right, where you see a high level of a high level of mobility, and here in the late 20th century, you see the West with something of a sort of it's a complicated pattern that I'll come back to, but sort of the takeaway from this is that you've got these different things going on in different regions. All right, so Midwest, Northeast, some deterioration, improvement in the northern plains and mountains. That's that light area in the second set of maps, persistent low in the South. Okay, so now to go into this, we're trying to sort of struggle with these broad descriptive results. And we, again, we did what we could with the kinds of data that were available to us over relatively long periods of time. And those of you who do this kind of work know that the farther back in time you go, the harder you struggle to get reasonably consistent data indicators at the geographical scales that you want them. But here's what we did. We thought about two different things. One would be what we might call the structure and geography of the economy. So the basic notion there is that an economy, a capitalist economy, changes a lot through time in its structure and its geography. That to use a metaphor, the early 20th century up to roughly, let's call it the 60s and 70s, is a period dominated by what you might call the second industrial revolution. That is technologies that are electrical, mechanical, fossil fuel based, heavily oriented toward manufacturing. That, of course, starts in the late, like say in the 1870s, 1880s. And in the US, it is the period where the US heavily urbanizes and industrializes and becomes a major manufacturing power. So and then if you think about the late 20th century and early 21st, we might think of this as the new economy dominated by the third industrial revolution, the digital, scientific capitalism, service-oriented transformation, especially of innovative, high-wage work. And that these two economies have different geographical patterns, they have different employment bases, they reward different people in different educational categories. And the other thing to bear in mind for the US case, of course, which I think would be very different from Europe, is that over the 20th century, the US urban system, so there's not only these cyclical developments, meaning going from the old manufacturing dominated pattern of incomes and employment to the late 20th century third industrial revolution pattern, but also that the US urban system is building itself out. The population is diffusing continentally. There are major new waves of urbanization. So that's really different from, say, European countries where the basic urban pattern is set and there's less population change. So we want to look at the structure of the economy, both cyclically and in the long run, as a potential source of change in the places that offer different childhood conditions and hence different levels of social mobility. We also want to look at persistence, or what we call deep roots. And the things that we looked at are long-term inequality, which might be different from cyclical inequality. We know that income inequality peaked in the early 20th century, and it's peaking again today. And in between, there's a great leveling, or what's called the great leveling in income inequality in the US. But we want to differentiate from that and look at the different ways that regions or, well, state economic areas aggregated up relate to inequality. Maybe some regions are persistently more unequal no matter what the national inequality is doing. Second is we tried to look for proxies of what we might call something like class relations, and these are crude proxies, but what we settled on was looking at educational dropouts as some kind of indicator on how well or how poorly a place is doing in terms of pulling the people in the economy into education and keeping them there as an inclusive social structure, as opposed to one where we see a lot of educational dropouts, which we think is something like a proxy for a differentiated class-oriented society. Of course, another major dimension of that would be segregation and race relations. We also took into account some controls on different groups of immigration, actually the way that Leah talked about. So we did some causal probing using some of these things. So here's how basically how we operationalized that. We took these kind of factors: median household income, manufacturing share as an indication of the geography of the second industrial revolution, patent productivity as a kind of rough indicator of the knowledge economy or the sort of elite R&D high wage functions, population density and urban share as indications of how urban and what kind of urban, local income inequality, again, as I mentioned, indication of class structure, high school dropout rate, foreign-born share, bearing in mind that share doesn't tell us enough about the who of the immigration, that is where they're coming from and when they're coming from. I'll come back. And Black share, of course, as a core dimension of everything American, and notably as some kind of indication of possible segregation. So, all right, so what did we find? What we find, again, so the blue dots are the early 20th century, how they influence the story, and the orange triangles are late. And what you can see is that this is early 20th century characteristics, right? And how they're gonna influence this intergenerational social mobility of children as they become adults. And what we can see there, the takeaway here is that manufacturing share does provide a lot of intergenerational social mobility early in the century, but it doesn't anymore. Now, it's a pretty obvious conclusion, but it's actually kind of important to remember that in the heyday of the second industrial revolution, the Northeast and the Midwest had very high levels of social mobility because something about manufacturing enabled people who got into that to create conditions for their children that enabled them to be fairly socially mobile. That's no longer true. The median household income, that was something that really surprised us. We thought it would have a really positive effect in general, and it is sort of positive, but it's weakened, and that we think is because the median doesn't indicate as much because of greater inequality as a whole, greater income inequality as a whole. Patent productivity also surprised us, and meaning that first of all, back in the old days, the manufacturing regions actually had a lot of patent productivity. They were the knowledge economy of the day. Today, they are no longer the knowledge economy of the day. The patents are pumped out by superstar cities like San Francisco, San Jose, New York, Boston, and Washington. In the old days, the patents were pumped out by Detroit, Cleveland, and the real technological superstar places of the day. Why that wouldn't anymore being related to intergenerational social mobility, maybe because the knowledge workers of today are in some kind of income and education segregated world. So urbanization, again, trying to get a handle on this is hard in the US context, but what you see is that in the old days, right, manufacturing was located in a set of Northeast and Midwest highly urban clusters. Today, if again, for the non-American, it's important to understand that while technically US urbanization rates rose throughout a lot of the 20th century, it was also accompanied by the great suburban transition. We were an urban nation up to about 1920. From about 1920 onward, we became a suburban nation. And there are little exceptions like New York City and the old areas of some East Coast cities, but basically this is a suburban country. And so what we see is some kind of like a weakening relationship. And that could probably, we need to know more about this. Dylan and I are actually trying to figure out ways to construct the data back in time. It relates to something about neighborhood effects and about the structure of cities today. But the point is that, in the old days, being a worker in manufacturing in what was by those terms, dense urban cities really was good for social mobility. Now we sort of turn to the social structural proxies for sociological forces. With all due apologies to sociologists, I'm a geographer, so this is probably really bad. But again, in the early days, the high school dropout rate and income inequality were very bad for social mobility, and they still are. So these are constants over time, and I can tell you that they are heavily Southern dominated, right? That one of the stories behind the persistent low levels of social mobility in the South is that it's always been more unequal in terms of income, and it always, and even today, has a higher high school dropout rate. So something about social structure going on there. Now, foreign-born share and Black share are more complex. First of all, it's interesting that in both periods, there's a positive effect of foreign-born share. Now, again, Leah already sort of showed you what that means in concrete terms. But in the old days, right, there was a great wave of immigration from 1870 to 1920. It was a wave mostly of European immigration to the Northeast and Midwest. And that foreign-born share in that second industrial revolution period was associated with high level. There was a lot of social mobility associated with places that welcomed immigrants. There still seems to be today, and actually I want to think about how this result relates to the stuff that Leah was presenting. But we know that the foreign-born shares today are geographically different, as well as different in terms of national origin from what they were at the previous peak of immigration in the early 20th century. But they are also heterogeneous today, meaning you've got points in the Northeast and Midwest, like the New York metropolitan region, and you've of course got the southern border regions and our West Coast regions, and of course Southern Florida, which are the really high foreign-born shares. But it still seems to exercise a positive effect. Now, so Black share is interesting because it's negatively associated with social mobility, but not in a big changing way. And we think that that's because actually the South probably, we know that the South actually did somewhat better in places where the Black share was high. And the sort of the intuition about that would be that these areas were heavily rural enclaves with very, very high levels of segregation and low levels of education for Black people in the South. And what happened was that actually the decentralization of manufacturing from the Northeast and Midwest into rural areas of the South probably produced a positive association with Black share and social mobility because of that economic change that happens in the South roughly from the 1960s onward, when the old South starts to weaken a bit. Okay, so now Black share, though, is still a very powerful indicator of, we might say, low levels of social mobility, but again, with some differentiated change. Again, to kind of come back to this picture we're trying to understand, regional economic specialization. The old specialization is the second industrial revolution. The new local economic specialization is split between the high wage, high skill, highly college educated areas of the third industrial revolution, mostly about 15 superstar cities. Those places that are highly specialized in those require high levels of formal education. And formal education is probably a bigger barrier to access today than was the equivalent of a high social mobility type of employment in the early 20th century, which was manufacturing. You didn't need a lot of education to get into manufacturing and rise up the occupational scale within a firm. You do today. So that returns us kind of indirectly, it returns us from regional economic specialization to the role of education. Internal migration, very important for social mobility historically. As Patrick mentioned, since 1980, interstate migration is declining. It is, as he also mentioned from Issy Roman's data, more income sensitive. So high educated, high income move up the urban hierarchy. Other native born and without college degree are net moving out of high income places to other places, or they're circulating among the rest of the urban cities system outside of the superstar city. So this is really different from the 1880 to 1980 pattern. And the reason it relates powerfully, I think, to one of our results is that the high social mobility that we find of people in the late 20th century who grow up in the upper Midwest. So they're growing up in these relatively small city, rural areas with a heavy agricultural imprint, but their adult lives where they have the high social mobility is they go to the big cities and the coasts because they got a lot of educational advantages in their childhood. So these are very good childhood areas. And as long as you can move out of them, you can do very well as an adult when you move to San Francisco or New York or Boston or one of the places where you capitalize on your childhood advantages. So again, to kind of bring it together, is the current geography of opportunity something new or a continuation? It's both. There's both change and stability. The persistence and stability stuff is deep roots, especially in the South, like durable social structure, political attitudes, segregation, educational equality. The change is from the changing geography of employment types and opportunities as the economy goes through different waves of creative destruction. Again, to sort of conclude and maybe to sort of echo, what Patrick was talking about in terms of policy, I'll say, we are really struggling with what would one tell a policymaker about what to do. Obviously, we would like to make declining low opportunity places more like high opportunity places. How would we do that? The easy sort of recommendations are make sure everyone gets educated, get rid of high school dropout-ism, make sure that you eliminate racial segregation. But of course, as both Leah and Patrick pointed out, there are enormous barriers to do that at much finer levels of granularity, both geographically and of course, educationally in relationship to the new economy that we're now living in. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we can move on with the discussion of Clara. So Clara, do you want to share your slides?
Sure. Okay, so can you see my screen? Yes, no? Okay, so first, thank you very much for inviting me to this super exciting interdisciplinary seminar. I have learned a lot from all the presentations and discussions. So I'm gonna discuss the paper by Michael, The Changing Geography of Social Mobility in the US. And let me start by saying that the recent rise that we have seen in income inequalities across many world regions, not only the US, but also a moderate rise in Europe and some other countries such as India, Russia, and China since the 1980s, has partly prompted a great public concern about the possible deterioration of equality of opportunities. And this has, of course, given rise to a renewed interest by academics in measuring and understanding the evolution of economic opportunity. And one of the common measures that one can use to assess the degree of economic opportunity is what we call absolute income mobility, the fraction of children earning more than their parents. And this is exactly what this paper is gonna look at. But until now, until very recently, evidence about the evolution, and in particular the historical evolution of absolute income mobility in the US, but also in other countries, has been very scarce, and evidence non-conclusive. So why is it the case? On the one hand, until very recently, we lacked large high-quality panel data sets that link children to their parents, and only survey data was available. And also we know that the estimates are quite sensitive to econometric assumptions and sample specification, and that's why papers and different research studies were reaching different and mixed conclusions. So with the bulk of the administrative data revolution, there has been a significant improvement in the estimates of intergenerational social mobility. And there are several recent studies on intergenerational income mobility using admin data. So the seminal work using admin data is the one by Chetty for the US. But in the last 2 to 3 years, there has been a bulk of research using this type of data, of admin data, for Australia, Canada, Denmark, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain. So those are all countries for which at least I'm aware of any study using admin data. And what I would like to do in the discussion is to put all these studies into comparison. So for instance, this figure compares, of course, these estimates are for the late 20th, early 21st century. So those are similar to the Opportunity Atlas of the US. So this first figure shows the probability of reaching the top quantile coming from the bottom quantile in these different countries for which we have these estimates. And what you see is that as we all know, is that Nordic countries have higher levels of upward mobility. Like the southern of Europe is a bit sort of in the middle. Switzerland has also high levels in comparative perspective. And what is the focus of the paper that I'm discussing is on the US. And what you see is that in a comparative perspective, the US has lower levels of social mobility. Let me say that this graph comes from a recent paper by one PhD student at PSC, Javier Soria, who is also, I think, in the call today, who has done the very first estimate for the Spanish context. And if we also look at another measure of intergenerational income mobility, which is the mean child percentile rank for parents at the 25th percentile, we still see that the US is doing worse in relative terms than the rest of analyzed countries using this admin data. So this is what also has led to many scholars and also the public space to say that the American dream is under scrutiny, right? And basically, this can be explained by many different factors. Here I highlight some of the factors that have been put forward. So some scholars have argued that these differences might be due to common structural changes in economies and occupational structures across the developed world. Another factor could be that comparatively, in the US, the less advantaged early life influences related to parenting, family structure, and endowments. Also, policies might matter, so different national policies can shape the labor market and educational impacts of structural economic change. And recently, there has been new evidence emphasizing that varying neighborhood and family contexts can shape life chances. And basically, the conclusion from these studies is that low levels of intergenerational mobility can be partly understood as a local problem. And this is where the paper of Michael kicks in. The contribution of his paper is, I think, in my view, twofold. On the one hand, I believe it has an important historical and methodological contribution, given that he analyzes the geographical evolution of intergenerational social mobility in the US, taking a longer perspective, so since the early 20th century. And for that, he uses both census and IRS data and neighborhood scale variation. And the second contribution, which is what I call the substantive contribution, is to show that the long-term geography of intergenerational mobility can be explained through two interacting forces. On the one hand, the deep roots, and on the other hand, the changing economic fortunes of places. And so those are the main takeaways from the paper. First, that early childhood environments have become more important for upward mobility and economic development less important than a century ago. Also, that changes in upward mobility at present are strongly a function of the growing value placed on education, with education depending heavily on schooling and schooling on family structures in early life. This upward mobility is favored when deeply rooted and entrenched structures reduce intergenerational interpersonal inequality and expand schooling access. And finally, one of the interesting, I believe, findings of the paper is that the overall reshuffling of the geography of jobs and incomes has changed the landscape of intergenerational mobility. And we see that upward mobility has declined sharply in the Midwest and risen sharply in the North Plain and Mountain region. So Michael has already done a great job in presenting the mechanisms and the different factors that they explore in the paper. I will just have some comments regarding the comparability of the different periods, given that this is a historical paper, and also about the role of gender, which is, I think, the only dimension I could think of that Michael has not focused on. So one of the questions it came to my mind when I was reading the paper is how, I know it's an unfair comment, but I was wondering whether you can maybe elaborate a bit on that. How comparable are the estimates from the early 20th to the late 20th century, given that basically the sources are different, and also the sample is different? For instance, if I understood correctly, women are excluded from the early 20th century sample, but not from the from the most recent sample. And so I was wondering whether, and this is probably food for thought for future research, whether the results would change if women would be excluded from the late 20th century analysis. And I'm making this comment also, as I said, more like a food for thought, because from my understanding and my reading from the literature, the role of gender has not been so much studied. And there is some preliminary evidence, sorry that the map cannot be clearly seen, but this is directly taken from the paper and it was already like that. But there is a paper by Chetty and co-authors where they basically look at the differences in employment rates at age 30 by commuted zone where the children grew up. And so darker colors represent areas where men have lower employment rates than women. And actually, when I look at this map, it resembles, I mean, it's not perfect, but it resembles a bit the maps that you have on your intergenerational income mobility measures. So I was wondering whether gender and these differences in employment rates that are so different across different commuting zones in the US might have also played a role in explaining the recent estimates on intergenerational social mobility, and whether if these estimates are different to the ones in the early 20th century, whether this might be also part of the explanation why we see these differences. Again, I understand that probably for the early 20th century, it's super hard to do this analysis by gender, but probably for the recent period, it would be worth it to also maybe study the role of gender. And so I don't want to take more time from my discussion, but let me finish and open the discussion by this question. So what can be done to combat declining social mobility? And I have here enumerated several things that one can do and that have already been studied and analyzed. On the one hand, we can invest in factors that improve economic opportunities, such as education. And I think what the findings of this paper and the recent literature points out that inclusive local policies might matter a lot in order to combat this declining social mobility, given that the differences across space are important. Another possibility is to move to the opportunities, and there is evidence that this might have a positive effect as well on reducing poverty and improving social mobility. I would also like to add, given that I work on income, and I work on understanding the determinants of income and wealth inequalities, that although indirectly, of course, policies aim at reducing income and wealth inequalities, such as, for instance, progressive taxation, might also have an effect, a positive effect on social mobility. And actually, Michael shows that income inequality matters tremendously to explain social mobility estimates. Another angle that I think is relevant is the fact that the population, it has been shown that for the US context, that the US population actually misperceives the estimates of social mobility in the US, and they actually overestimate the amount of social mobility. So of course, these misperceptions might also alter preferences for redistribution and also the type of policies that would improve social mobility, so that also targeting this aspect would potentially help as well. And finally, I would like to conclude, given that this is an interdisciplinary seminar, by saying that, of course, in order to combat declining social mobility, we also need more research and more cross-country comparisons and country-specific studies to understand the complex mechanisms that are behind this evolution of social mobility that Michael said is not only about economic factors, but also about deep root factors. So I leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Clara. So I think we are kind of running out of time, but maybe we can take 1 minute for some reactions or maybe one further question. And then we will conclude the workshop. So Laurent has a question.
Sorry, it's me again. It's more about, I'm curious how you determine the city footprint, actually, because in France, it's not that easy over time, okay? And currently we are using historical maps and try to determine the footprint with machine learning. So I was wondering how you do it for the US. You have maps or stuff like this to do so.
I mean, the simple answer is, again, going back in time, it's really a pain because the footprint of cities changes over time. So you can never get consistent geographical units from the early 20th century to the late in terms of their urbanness. In all of my research, this is a horrible problem of whether you take today's definitions and project backward, and basically what you're doing is incorporating what were non-urbanized areas then, or you look backward and you somehow try to add them up decade by decade over time. So the point, there's no good solution, at least that we found to that. However, we made some choices that we did some sort of robustness tests to see what we were losing, and I think we did reasonably well, with the degree of urbanization and the density thing, but it's imperfect, Laurent, and it's a real issue. You're right that we're trying to overcome today. And just one more point about Clara, like absolutely on the gender thing, it was very frustrating, as you can imagine, given the data. That's this thing about historical research, right, is what we have with old data. But I would add one other thing. that today it's not. There's obviously doing much better on gender, but also much better on what I think we would call in the U.S. whiteness, meaning that the white population differentiates very heavily along educational lines. And so it's not just whether you are an immigrant, whether you are Black, but what kind of white you are. And we know that this is a huge issue in America is low educational uptake among a certain part of the white population. So much more work probing whiteness and gender. You are totally right about those issues.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it's time to conclude. So I will give the floor to Laurent for a 1 minute conclusion. But
okay, it's going to be fast. So thanks a lot to the speakers and discussants. So I think it was a super interesting session. And it's very interesting interdisciplinary discussion. I'm glad it's at a workshop at PSC, at least virtually, because we are trying to develop that. One thing I would like to mention is that it's pretty US-centric, but it was already mentioned before. I was wondering to what extent we could do similar studies in the long run in US countries. So Clara showed us interesting statistics, I would say, for pretty recent periods. But what about going back on time for 2 centuries? Okay. So if I take France as an example, because I know more about it, there are different points, I think, that should be taken into account, like different histories of immigration. I was asking Leah before about different waves, over time. If you think about France, like more than 1 century ago, we had a lot of immigrants from Southern Europe, like Italy, Spain, Portugal, that succeeded pretty well. But after the Second World War and Reconstruction, it's more like immigrants from North Africa who were low skilled, okay, and to work in industries and construction. And then it didn't turn out so well, okay? So probably related to this is my second point, is about differences in policy with the US, because in France, we had all this public housing that was developed over time in specific places. It created segregation, okay? So I was wondering what could be done and is differently done actually in the US, because if you think about the US, there's a lot of emphasis on the Moving to Opportunity program, okay, such that you try to desegregate, like providing housing vouchers. In France, we are trying to get more scattered public housing, okay, so this is one of the main policies. So I guess you can get to a different results, and you can wonder whether it's due to, I would say, different efficient policies, but I don't think so. It's more about cultural differences. So I guess we can get to, maybe it's a good opportunity to think about the different policies that could be put in place in the different countries to try to deal with segregation. The last thing is about the differences in the data, okay? Because in the US, you can already rely a lot on the previous censuses, okay? It's not that much in case in France, or there are some census registries that are currently being exploited, but we don't have yet digitized data, okay? But I think the registries are pretty similar to those in the US. A big difference after 1940s is that we don't have income in the census. Okay, so I guess we have to work with socio-professional categories which have been used all the time in France, okay, in the census. So I guess that's all. It was just a few words, I think, because I think we need something in Europe. We need more. But it's nice to see the work in the US, especially you are citing each other, even if you are not in the same discipline. I think it's great. We are a bit more separated, I guess, or segregated by disciplines in Europe. Okay, so thanks a lot to all of you for assisting the workshop, and I hope there will be other workshops like that. Thank you again.
So the next one should be on environmental issues. So you will know more about that in a few months. So thank you very much again to the 3 presenters and the panelists and the audience. And it was really nice to have you all. And well, many thanks again.
Thank you guys for organizing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bonne soirée.